Hi folks, I'm here with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of, or generally to talk about the issue of stakeholder capitalism, which is a kind of phrase I'd heard around, stakeholder and capitalism. They've been put together, and it's certainly a centerpiece. And I think he's got even a book, or more than one book, out of this by Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum. That stakeholder capitalism is, in effect, a form of capitalism that recognizes there is no sovereign elected governments anywhere. Democracy doesn't exist. There's no borders. That the only sovereign entity permitted in this new world order is capital itself. And then there's a self-appointed, unaccountable, undemocratic elite of technocrats, which I think are going to be people like Bill Gates pretending they're experts in everything and so on. And these people will administer the world based on principles that they themselves invent and concoct and imagine and assert and enforce. So stakeholder capitalism is nothing more than a very tiny aristocratic elite imposing their will and their whims and their needs on everyone else. And capital, when you have borders and laws and elected governments and courts and this sort of thing, that gets in the way of capital being sovereign. And so the idea of stakeholder capitalism is they break all that down. Now they dress it up in nice phrases such, it's for the people and it's equality and it's equity. They put all those nice buzzwords out, but the reality is, as Herr Schwab has said, you'll own nothing and be happy. So it's an insert where capital becomes international and utterly mobile, but where the people live a communist existence of addressing their minimum needs. Now the genesis of this came really when Mr. Schwab sort of started out as I think he was like 29 or 30, and he created this think tank. Now at the time he had no achievements to his credit, but this guy, I think he was born in southern Germany and then lived in, as I understand, Switzerland for a long time, and he had this. He allegedly had this view, a bit like Greta Thunberg suddenly pops up as some icon for climate change. And at the age of 29, 30, he gets up and says he started this think tank, and this is like 1970, something like that. And suddenly, all the big names in the world are following, just like that. Yeah, like that happens in real life. So clearly he was a created poster child, a sleeper agent for the globalist project 50 years ago. And he must have done as he's told and so on, because he stayed as the front man and so. And look, for 80, 84, 85 years old, whatever he is, he's still quite lucid, and he's got it. I don't know how many injections they give him before they wheel him out on stage, but he's in pretty good condition. I've got not a neighbour, guy lives down the road. He's 85, and the guy can barely stand up, and he'll start a sentence and then he'll just suddenly go quiet and stare into the distance, and he's just a shell of what he was, even 10 years ago. So for his age and so on, Klaus Schwab's doing pretty good. Nonetheless, he's just a front man, a poster boy for the the goons downtown, as it were, and he's doing, I guess, as far as they're concerned, a passable job. But this is what the objective is. All borders, all elected governments, all laws, all these things just get in the way of the globalist project and the sovereignty of capital. And this is really what the globalization project is all about: replacing all other sovereignties with the sovereignty of capital. So I want to go back a little bit further. I don't think this is going to work, and already it's created vastly reduced standards of living for Western citizens. If I compare the purchasing power of the Western paycheck in 1970 compared to today, and the purchasing power has declined by, depending on whose numbers you want to look at, between sort of 58 and 63, 64%. That's the decline in purchasing power of the paycheck. And all the essentials in life, food, shelter, housing, energy, all those, that's where all the prices increases have come. The consumer goods that you don't need, you can choose to buy them or not. They've come down in price, but the essentials of life have all gone up. Housing as an example have gone up by more than threefold since 1970. Energy has gone up substantially. I mean, right now, given the recent energy price rises, that's gone up by more than 50%. Food is 30% more expensive, and just on it goes. But things like televisions and so on, they've gone down in price in purchasing power terms. So there's the Western citizen is losing horribly and substantially from globalization, which is why there's such brutal enforcement going on, using the police forces of all the countries, the FBI, CIA, all that sort of, using them to suppress any dissent, any questions, and any pushback against this globalist project. And there's not a single sovereign Western government anywhere across the Western world. They all are owned and controlled, infiltrated by the globalists. So this gives you an idea of the extent. But I want to talk about this idea that the globalists have, that you can kind of insert sort of a socialism, communism in terms of people, peasant management, if you will, and then insert if you like, an aggressive personal ownership capitalism for a tiny elite class. And when I say tiny, I'm not talking 1 in 100 or 1 in 200. I'm talking, 1 in maybe every 500 or 600 people, that sort of level of elite. And they're going to be the technical. Now, they're not going to be qualified in anything. And this is new territory in terms of developing an entire new world social, economic order. And so there'll be no experts in that. I suppose it has been tried in sort of ways before, but not in the way where you're fusing and merging aggressive super elite capitalism with in effect socialism for the masses. Now, one of the things that the right-wing think tanks were considering in the late 60s and early 70s was, you've got all this massive capital in the West, there's a lot of money there, and then you've got billions of impoverished peasants in the third world, and even behind the Iron Curtain in the communist era. And those people are not consumers or worker consumers in the sense of the Western world. So how do we get the capital, which is in abundance in the West, how do we get the capital to merge in together with the masses of peasants in the third world, for example? Now, in the third world, subsistence peasants, they don't exist economically. There's no accounting process that can measure them. They live subsistence and they live on barter. They just don't exist economically. They didn't exist. So the idea is to merge them with the capital, and that would create this paradise. And it's considered in dreamlike, starry-eyed terms, in the same way that a starry-eyed communist would imagine a Marxist utopia. This is the utopia that the globalists imagine. And it's just as starry-eyed and just as ridiculous and just as absurd, in my view. So I want to come back now to the phases of capitalism. Capitalism has existed for a long time. It's grown organically, particularly since the 1600s. And even earlier, if you go back to, say, the Italian merchant city-states and things like that. But capitalism has had the ability to transition, and I'll coined the phrase now, transitional capitalism, where it develops organically, often technologically, into a new form of capitalism. And I'll give some examples of what I mean by that. Now, probably many people have heard of the Malthusian trap, where population growth outstrips food production. And this was Thomas Malthus opined in the late 1700s in Britain that given the way population was growing and food production was growing, that by the 1830s, 1840s, somewhere around there, the world would begin to starve, or Western world and Britain in particular begin to starve, because food production can never keep up with population growth. Now, the parameters he was using at the time were quite sensible, by the way. If you look at his arithmetic and his calculations, it still stacks up today with the then technology and the then understanding of things. But transitional capitalism is where not just changing technology, but changing infrastructure, and to some extent changing attitudes, the way they come together to create a transition in capitalism. Capitalism stays, it just transitions to a new phase. Now, there was this idea of food production, what Malthus missed, and there's a few things here, and I'll talk about, say, food production. Now, there's a lot of farmland, particularly as you got out further away from, say, London, we'll talk about England for the moment, that wasn't being tilled, or was being planted and tilled very inefficiently. There was no need to be efficient, because the farmer could only sell his fruit and vegetables, or whatever he produced, milk, could be milk or butter or cheese or something, could only really sell it into the local area, because transport was so bad that in the winter the roads were impassable, and in summer, that because of the heat, the crops and the fruit and vegetables would spoil before they got anywhere near a major market. So because the farmer could only sell in the local area, he only tilled half his fields, and even then not very efficiently. He didn't really need fertilizer, because there was no need to produce a large crop, because again he couldn't really sell it. He just couldn't get it to market. Now, with the improvements in canals, river transport, the barges that were used, larger, more efficient ships for moving food, or if you were near a port or something, that type of thing, then you could have a bigger crop, because you could move your stuff around to a larger market, such as London or any other larger population centre. Now, this was an important issue, because as technology changed, railways and this sort of thing, then farmers could say, hey, I can now produce more crops, because I can get my produce to market. So they would then start to put more acreage under cultivation. Then on top of that, they would start to say, wow, I can sell everything that I can grow here. Now I'll use fertilizers. How can I be more efficient in the growing? So there were different harnesses used, so that instead of using oxen, you'd use horses. And so there were developments in technology of harnesses and of devices to or new irrigation systems, cutting better irrigation channels, greater use of things like water wheels and windmills for grinding, better location of windmills, improved technology for windmills, little incremental things all over the place. But the catalyst was, hey, I can now get my fruit and vegetables to a market 100 miles away, which was considered impossible previously. So because of that, then there were numerous other satellite or peripheral technology changes that, when you consider an aggregation, huge game changers in terms of food production. Then there were the vast areas around the Thames estuary that would be underwater for 6, 7, 8 months a year. So great effort was made to engage in all sorts of drainage, exercises in drainage, to turn that land into arable land for growing crops. So many tens of thousands of acres now came under cultivation. and so on. Then there was refrigeration, all sorts of stuff. So the economy transitioned, even though it's considered impossible for enough food to be produced. That when the means to produce more food, which involved many factors and sub-factors, but this was all driven by capitalism, and it was driven by there was a demand, there's a need for food, growing food, and so there was all these various exercises in again small technological leaps, but they were decisive when in aggregation. Now there's another paper that was going, or discussion was going around in, I think it was the 1740s in Britain, where what if everybody had a horse? Now this idea that it would take say farm workers that didn't live on the farm or something like that, they had to walk 15 miles there and 15 miles back in a day. This is before there were railways. There were the stagecoaches were quite expensive back in the day. A normal worker on a ship wage couldn't afford that. So on an agricultural wage couldn't afford that. So what if everybody had a horse? Then the worker could get to, instead of taking an hour and a half to get to work, the worker could get to work in 20 minutes, for example, if you had a horse. So there was discussion that if everyone had a horse, every household had a horse, that Britain or the world couldn't grow enough, straw or hay. This is horse food. Couldn't grow enough food for horses to eat, and thus the world would be without food because you simply wouldn't have enough. You wouldn't have enough acreage to be able to produce the amount of food needed to be able to feed all those horses. Now, of course, the technology changed so that railways came along, number one, and then, of course, automobiles later on, that sort of thing. So that whole concept of, well, we can't go to this next stage of capitalism or next stage of social development or next stage of economic development because the barriers preventing it are so great. That is, we can't grow enough food for the horses. So if everyone has a horse. So that's another example of, and yet another one was, would Britain run out of coal? Now, the demand for coal as the Industrial Revolution began kicking off, the demand for coal was such that people were saying, well, gee whiz, we'll run out of coal another 10 years because the demand for coal is so great, for factories and railways and so on and so forth. But the reality was that they divined, well, we can't go any deeper than X amount of feet or yards, meters below the surface because we don't have that capability. But there were huge advances in the technology of pumps and structures to drill out underground mines and then to buttress those with various other structures to hold the sort of the roof of the tunnel in and these sorts of things. Now, they weren't perfect, but what it meant was it changed from going 20 meters or whatever it was below the surface to suddenly they could go 100 meters. So therefore there were millions of tons of coal that was now accessible that was considered inaccessible previously due to technology. So there are all sorts of Armageddon, if you like, or pessimistic, not Armageddon, pessimistic views about there won't be enough coal, there isn't enough food to feed the horses, there won't be enough food for the people. But due to these many technological changes, which in turn created there's usually a major technological change, the steam engine, for example, and then there are many other sub changes that go around that, and they change the entire nature of capitalism. Now, this organic nature of capitalism, where through natural demand, natural changes, and new technologies and create other changes. That's what I call transitional capitalism. That's the one thing that makes capitalism sort of eternal, is that ability to transition. So that when resources, if resources are going to be run out in terms of for example, fossil fuel, the idea of artificially suppressing it is one thing, but the reality is that when the technology to develop energy comes along and it's cheaper than fossil fuel, it will automatically be used. There is no way it will not be used. And then in turn, peripheral to that, there'll be other technological changes and developments and movements that will in turn transition capitalism. So capitalism can reinvent itself. Socialism, communism, all these other things cannot. Now, the one thing that I believe is the very root of failure for the World Economic Forum, stakeholder capitalism, is nothing organic about it. It's being forced against the will of the people. It's riding roughshod over all accountabilities. The people have no say, and so on, and don't have to agree, can again simply be forced on. That sort of tyranny and autocracy ultimately, I believe, is doomed to fail, as it as it states in the novel 1984. There's a great scene where John Hurt and Richard Burton in the it's got to be 30 years ago now, that movie was made, where they the John Hurt character, or the Winston character, says, in the end the people will beat you and they will tear you to pieces. And I hope and think and believe that's what's going to happen to the World Economic Forum type people. Now, if they want to go around the world and say to a sovereign government, do you want to buy into this? Let's have a referendum, that's different. I see that differently, where the benefits and the lack of benefits, the disbenefits, are clearly spelled out. But they're not doing it. They're just infiltrating governments all over the world and getting it to be through deception and manipulation and outright force and outright treachery. They're imposing it on the people without their consent, and that is the basis ultimately for its failure. One of the things about transitional capitalism, it takes people with it. Now, not everyone's necessarily happy about how things go, and that's also part of the wider dialectic. But the reality is that it's happening through organic means, which adds up to a far greater degree of agreement, buy-in, if you like, by the populace than any other way of changing things. You've been with Tacitus today. You're a Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.